All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Wayne Cruz, originally our episode 3 guest. He's also my colleague and the Fred L. Smith Fellow in Regulatory Studies at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Welcome back to Free the Economy, Wayne.
You bet. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, Richard.
So, we're here to talk about that big blockbuster report, 10,000 Commandments, an annual snapshot of the federal regulatory state, should be just fresh off the presses as everyone is listening to this. And every year, people want to know the big headline number first. How much did federal regulation cost us all last year?
Well, no matter how many times I tell people that you can't measure the cost of regulation, that it's internal to those regulated and the external observer can't always assess a price on it. I call it a placeholder, but everybody says it's a calculation, but I use a placeholder. This year, that comes out to 2.155 trillion as my placeholder. Just by comparison, the NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers, has a 3.079 figure, accurate out to that fourth decimal place. Really important stuff. But the idea of this is not to say that we on the outside can gauge what environmental, social, health and safety, paperwork, labor, all these rules cost. It's to make Congress be accountable for regulations. So just for a little bit of extra context too, when I first started doing this report or write-ups like it, late 90s, early 2000s, the Small Business Administration and OMB used to try to do an aggregate cost estimate of regulation. And among economists, the debate wasn't whether you should do some calculation, but whether it should be bottom up or top down, macroeconomic, that sort of thing. What I have is kind of a mix. I pulled together those early federal estimates for cost of regulations, which they now tend to disavow. And that's the progressive way. How can this be costly? This is all beneficial. If we'd like government to run this, surely an incremental step can't be costly. So the tendency is not to measure the stuff. But I put this together, several hundreds of billions of dollars at that time. And what I like to do here in these latter years is I kind of have like those first 20 years of the 20th century, of the 21st century. And then each time the OMB, it still does but they're usually tardy, puts out a cost benefit report. And in that, there'll be of 3,000 rules every year, there are a few dozen at best that have cost and benefit analysis. So what I like to do is incorporate those along with a little bit of an inflator for economic cost of regulation. And so I use that placeholder to kind of put a gauge in place where you can compare it with federal taxes. Like, for example, and outlays. This year, the federal government's expected to spend $7 trillion. The deficit is $2 trillion. That's regulatory costs and the deficit are kind of on a par right now. Since COVID, we've had these $2 trillion deficits. But it's good to have the figure like that just to compare it with what folks pay in income taxes, corporate taxes, and things like that. So that's the reason, and for Congress to take some responsibility for it all.
Well, yeah, and of course, when we talk about OMB, we're talking about the Office of Management and Budget in the White House. That's in charge of a lot of analysis and reporting on government expenditures. So the newest edition of the report says that U.S. households, speaking of, comparisons that are sort of understandable to people, U.S. households pay an average of $16,000 in regulatory costs, which, we call sort of a hidden tax in a way because it makes things more expensive, but it's not readily discernible. And that's 16% of income, 21% of household expenses. And that's more than most households pay on healthcare or food or transportation, all these other categories. Only housing is really the bigger single cost. So maybe we will assume this is already the case, but do you think most people have a real understanding of that is how much regulations are costing people? Because I think normal Americans have some idea that government red tape increases costs. But do you think most people are kind of understand that scale of it?
Well, I don't. There's, and it's not because they're doing anything wrong. Fred Smith, our founder, would say, people are rationally ignorant. They don't necessarily know what costs are. And in good times, we tend to see price declines and technological advances. Things get more affordable rather than less. until you have a crisis like we had. But sometimes numbers like that stick. I mean, we're lucky and blessed in that each year, that household figure does get some traction in the media. And there's certain things that people latch onto. For example, I've got the little blurb in there about paperwork costs. And if you were to take OMB, its estimate for hours of paperwork burden, it ends up being, like 15,000 human lifetimes, in terms of paperwork costs, so things like that catch on. But when you say, yeah, wow, regulation, it's more expensive than everything, these embedded costs, because it's embedded in everything that we pay for, but it's more costly than everything in your budget except housing. I think that, that gets some traction. It gets a little bit of attention. And those figures on household expenditures, come from the Census Bureau, Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so taking the regulatory figure and compare it to that is important and useful. Same thing with country comparisons. I mean, the US has a near 30 trillion GDP, but if you were to forget about that and just take that 2 trillion regulatory costs, if regulation were a country, it would be like the eighth largest country right behind in the world, right behind the Russian Federation. So things like that are ways to get attention. But you raise a point, though. It's not like regulation is, you call it a hidden tax, and regulation is like that. It has never gotten the same kind of attention that the federal outlays, federal spending, the debt, the deficit. We've got a debt now that'll soon be crossing the $40 trillion mark. That catches people's attention. And what I hope is that regulation does too. I use that 2 trillion placeholder, but of course, in terms of regulations bogging down of the economy and our ignoring everything from the early antitrust regulations, so forth, in most of the 20th century, I think regulatory costs are way beyond what I say of, as the $2 trillion figure. But we try to get the interest, try to get Congress to pay attention. And some of the reforms that we mentioned in the report are useful in that respect too, to shine a light on it, because we ought to be able to look up regulatory burdens the same way we do fiscal matters in the historical tables in the federal budget, just for example.
Yeah, and so it's interesting. So we're in an unusual situation now where President Trump has been elected to these non-consecutive terms, and that gives us, I feel like, an opportunity, just going back several years, to compare Trump 45 to Biden to Trump 47. Obviously, anytime you move between Democrat and Republican, there's going to be some policy change. I think even more dramatic between Biden and the current Trump administration. Trump 47 has been a departure in a lot of ways from precedent. What has that kind of like policy roller coaster been like when it comes to your thing, federal rulemaking?
Yes. Actually, I'm glad you asked that. Remember, the first Trump administration was defined by one in, two out. He set up what he called regulatory reform task forces within the agencies to review rules and regulations. He did my favorite thing, which was an executive order requiring that what we call regulatory dark matter, the guidance documents, memoranda, circulars, bulletins, notices, letters. I made a word cloud of all the different varieties. But this regulatory dark matter under Trump was incorporated within agencies into portals, into guidance document portals. I thought that was really, really significant. But the essence of Trump's reforms in the first term were cost freeze, basically, because it was a one in, two out program. But the essence of it was to make regulatory costs flat, net zero. Once Biden came in, literally on day one, he issued a memoranda called Modernizing Regulatory Review that wiped out virtually all of the Trump regulatory program. It is good that Trump set up the guidance document portals, because even though Biden abolished them, just having done that, where I could only point to a few thousand guidance documents, even last year, I did a Halloween dark matter, dark lore depository compilation of all the guidance documents that you could locate, just because of the residual effects of the Trump order. And it turned out that I could still uncover over 100,000 of them. So while most of the Trump orders were omitted or ejected, some things had some lingering power, and we can take a little bit of hope in that. Then when Trump came in, he wiped out when I was doing this report, and I think we talked about it on some earlier episodes, and we talk about it a lot in the office. But when Biden knocked out the Trump agenda of streamlining, he replaced it with what he called whole of government interventions in climate equity, justice, financial regulations, the care economy, all these sorts of ways that the federal government was going to do everything top down. In Trump 2.0, Trump has already done over 100 executive orders. There's been nothing like that since I've been compiling this report. But it's been a tremendous number of executive orders. And Trump has his own, what I call swamp things, his interventionist impulses, like in antitrust, in AI, and obviously the tariffs that we spend so much time on. But to the extent that he's doing good things or favorable things on deregulation, it's not 1 in, 2 out now. It's 1 in, 10 out. And it's not a net zero budget. It's got you got to take it down to negative budget. It's not regulatory reform officers in the agencies. Instead, it's DOGE team leads in the agencies that work up and compile deregulations. It's not the old stuff in the first administration. Oh, well, let's get rid of regulations that don't have cost benefit or that are efficient or have negative, kind of the platitudes that our whole movement uses all the time. Instead, this time, he lists recent Supreme Court decision. He says, wow, when you look at these, a lot of the regulations are illegal and they're unconstitutional. And so where in the past we would use the good cause exemption to put a regulation through, now we're going to experiment with using good cause exemptions to get rid of regulations that shouldn't be there. And so it's an interesting twist. And in these various campaigns, he has said, well, if the courts rule against us, we're going to follow what the court says. So I think what's happening, and I believe people expected it too, is there's a test to see what the courts will say in terms of the existing regulatory state and this new attempt to streamline it. And so one of the things I would look for, the DOGE effort is out there, of course, to help incorporate all of this. It has been subordinated to what the agency heads say can be done, in terms of cutting grants and cutting rules and cutting personnel, all those sorts of things. But it'll be interesting to watch because I've seen there's more of an appreciation this time around, too, of what I've felt, what's bothered me ever since. In fact, I just did a blog about this today on the response to crisis, but this fusion of spending and regulation, that so many of the things that Congress is doing are already regulatory before they get down to the agencies that we spend our careers worrying about. And of course, after COVID, you had the various interventions there, but then you had the inflation law, the infrastructure law, the chips and science law, all of that stuff highly interventionist. So there's a little bit of a twist, too, in the Trump deregulatory program this time, in that it's not alongside addressing spending, which we hope he does. But as it looks like, the spending's going to go up. But there is an effort using DOGE, using other resources to go after contracts and grants and so forth that I think are the source of a lot of the off the books kind of regulatory laundering, a little similar to, or a version of dark matter, if you will. So DOGE may not be cutting a lot of spending right now, but for example, going after EPA grants or NED grants and so forth, it's kind of stepping on the trachea of the ones who are the loudest in proclaiming the case for bigger government. So I think in that sense, it's a very, very different environment. There's such a flurry of executive orders and executive actions that's difficult for those on the outside to quickly adapt. There's a whole lot of things on the grants, on the regulatory rollbacks, going after the various sectors. One that I liked a lot was telling states that they need to be ready for crises rather than rely on the federal government. So there's a lot of stuff going on, be a lot to digest. It's coming out very quickly, but there are the weird things too. I mentioned antitrust and the tariffs, but Trump coming out with Kid Rock in the Oval Office to say we're going to regulate ticket prices, and I was thinking, I said, he needs to exercise these deregulatory muscles a little bit better, because if the free market can't handle entertainment, there's not a lot it can handle. So about that before you do a goofy rule. They were quite articulate when they came out, but it was bad economics and a bad case. And generally the problems, and often you'll find, and this was an issue with Joe Biden too, there's a tendency of Biden and Trump both to have a little bit of a weak spot for price regulations and cost, pharmaceuticals and now ticket prices, hospitality, airline regulations. But guess what? Those industries that they are saying the market is failing in are actually industries where government is heavily, heavily involved. So some of the most already pre-regulated industries are the ones that are getting targeted as market failures. So that's one of the themes, and it's in 10,000 Commandments too. The problem is usually more of a political failure than a market failure. And so, we just have to keep beating that drum. And I think, we'll do it this week in the new report, and we'll keep it up.
Well, yeah, and the I should say that there are now ticket services that don't include service fees like Ticketmaster. So we've already
Okay.
seen market responses to that.
Mhm.
But so in like a big picture way, the one of the perennial talking points about rules that come out by the executive branch is that whatever is done by one president can be undone by another. And like you said, we've already sort of seen that in Trump versus Biden versus Trump 2.0. So if we want to have like more, so substantive, durable policy changes, whether it's about the process of making rules, kind of which we're talking about now, which is how rules are made in the first place, or specific rules, you would need, Congress to pass a new law, right, to have like longer term change. What do you think is the prospect for Congress rather than White House executive branch people stepping up and doing some sort of like long term substantive reform on regulatory change?
Yes, I'm really glad you brought that up, actually, because it's extremely true. In the same way that Trump 1.0 got overturned by executive order, Trump 2.0 could also get overturned by executive order, unless there's some congressional enactment of those regulatory reforms. But I hate to say that it's been 30. We were just talking about how old 10,000 Commandments
Mhm.
is, you and I, but it's the case that it's been 30 years since major regulatory reforms were enacted by Congress. Back when the Congressional Review Act, the Unfunded Mandates Act, the Small Business Enforcement Fairness Act, things of that sort, regulatory right to know that gives us those OMB cost estimates every year. So it's been a long time since we had bipartisan interest in regulatory reforms. But sometimes you get weird things that happen. In the middle of the Biden administration, there was a law passed that requires now in the Federal Register, and not a lot of people know this, but the beginning of every Federal Register rule has to have a little 100-word summary capsule of what the rule's about and what it does. Transparency can matter a lot. But in the Trump administration already, I'd put kind of together kind of like a little hierarchy of the easiest stuff to do to the hardest. And the easiest stuff is the things that Trump has just frozen. That's already fallen out of the funnel. He froze all of Biden's proposed rules. That's a good thing to do. But as you say, a new administration would simply reignite those. But then there's also the major rules that could be overturned by the Congressional Review Act from Congress. And as for Congress stepping in, despite there being many dozens of rules eligible, there have only been two, maybe three by now, rules overturned using resolutions of disapproval from the Congressional Review Act. So it's very, when you talk about 3,000 rules coming out every year and each year compounding, but then we just get rid of a few, that's not very much either. Then looking at the larger major rules, that's where I think the Trump order to look at the legality of rules and either do a notice and do a quick rule, interim final rule to quickly issue those changes could happen. If those rulemakings happen, they are laws, just like laws from Congress. So that's something he could do. But it is the case on the general reforms of the way we do the process. It's got to take Congress. But a couple of pieces of good news on that is the House of Representatives has already passed the so-called REINS Act, which stands for Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny. And it would, where the Congressional Review Act, Congress people have to get up on their hind legs and do a resolution of disapproval. This simply says that major rules aren't effective. They're not law until Congress approves them, affirms them. House has passed that, not the Senate. This has happened before. So, but that's one of the positive reforms. Another, other things are in place. For example, Joni Ernst has a piece of legislation called the Scrub Act, which would institutionalize DOGE. It would create an entity like DOGE within the federal government responsible for reviewing. Because remember, DOGE goes away next year. It goes away in America 250. It's a temporary project. Lay all this stuff out, figure out what's what, and then decisions need to be made. And those decisions, as you say, have to be enactments by Congress. But the Scrub Act is one of those important reforms that could lead to what we've always termed like a regulatory reduction commission, to review rules. and sunset rules. Trump had put out an important sunsetting executive order a couple of weeks ago that James Roll wrote about last week also. But inserting within each rule a deadline, where the rule goes away unless the agencies continue it and demonstrate why it's worth continuing. So that kind of thing. Other things we propose, like regulatory cost budgeting, there's pieces of legislation for all of this. I would think the easiest stuff is the things that are geared toward transparency. I mentioned the RAINS Act has passed the House, but also that has passed the House is the GOOD Act, the Guidance Out of Darkness Act, which we've worked on quite a bit with respect to putting together portals for guidance documents, like Trump had done through executive order, but this time it's done through Congress. The House has passed it, not the Senate. But in past Congresses, there have been numerous hearings in the Senate about it. I surprise people when you tell them that Kamala Harris was one of the original co-sponsors as a California senator of the GOOD Act, the Guidance Out of Darkness Act. So there's occasionally bipartisan interest in regulatory reform. You're not seeing it in this current environment, but you do see it when small businesses, state and local governments, governors come to Washington complaining about red tape. One of the things that worries me about them coming to the fore right now and complaining about red tape like they did back in the 90s is kind of what we had opened this program with. There have been so much federal spending and subsidies, grants in aid, and so forth, and so much of it is tied to taking regulatory actions at the state and local level and at the business level, of course, that where states and local governments who are drivers of regulatory reform and relief from federal red tape, they've kind of been bought off in a way. They're so dependent and enjoy and love to implement federal programs that they're not necessarily the allies in regulatory reform that you would expect. And I suspect, Richard, that that's one of the reasons that you're seeing this administration and DOGE go after grants and contracts and procurements and things like that with so much fervor, because even though those are not always the gargantuan spending programs you want to see cut, they're part of the oxygen for the regulatory state. So it's kind of it'll be an interesting dynamic. It'll be an interesting development to watch. But getting right back to your question, all of this requires congressional action, or the next Congress the next administration that comes in can reinstate all of the programs that aren't dealing. Trump is getting rid of programs that aren't agency core missions. It's like social policy programs, and he's getting those out. But a new administration will simply put all of those back. They'll invoke the care economy. They'll invoke fairness. We say it's markets, but they'll invoke all of these things to just reinflate the balloon. So that's why I emphasize, too, that a lot of regulatory reform now has to be legislative reform in terms of terminating departments, agencies, and commissions. We see it a little with the Department of Education, with some of the endowment groups and things like that. I just heard there's a new freeze on science funding and things like that. It's a good time to review a lot of those things.
Well, yeah, back in episode 108, I was talking with Susan Dudley, who's the former administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, sort of regulatory czar at the White House.
Yeah.
She was there under George W. Bush. And I was sort of, thinking back to some, previous generations of, White House regulatory policy and the, regulatory reform initiatives. And it seems like the Trump people have done things that previous administrations have sort of wanted to do, but the sort of White House counsels have said, "Oh, well, this will generate too many lawsuits. This will generate too much pushback. We can't do this. It won't go anywhere," including all of these staff reassignments. This civil service people being laid off, being fired, being reassigned. People in previous generations that said, "Oh, well, you can't." Every Republican administration has wanted to sort of cut back on the sort of deep state bureaucrats.
Yeah.
But people said, "Oh, well, there's the 1978 Civil Service Act, and there's these laws, and you can't do that. You can't touch it. It's too complicated. It should be too much trouble." And the Trump people don't seem to be deterred by that, at least this time.
Right.
But of course, we've seen this tsunami flurry, whatever your metaphor is, of lawsuits challenging all of these not even the most high profile ones like the immigration and the other stuff, but even just the sort of the relatively boring stuff, right? There's been a bunch of lawsuits about. So do you think, because this seems like maybe these are like the two major options here. Either the Trump people are going too far and they're going to get pushed back and a lot of this stuff is going to get overturned, or previous Republican administrations who said they wanted to do this stuff were just way too timid in pushing forward on it.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a mix of both. I think not like, for example, the earlier executive order I'd mentioned on taking the Supreme Court cases and using just good cause exemption to push rules through quickly. Some of that will stick, but not all of it will, and that's probably fine. But you're making a point about who should be making the laws and who shouldn't. Should be Congress making laws and not the regulators. Another one of the key reforms you mentioned, Susan and some of the prior directors at OIRA. Um, it was bipartisan for them to favor not just the cost benefit analysis of executive branch agencies, but also independent agencies like the FCC, the FTC, and the financial agencies that you work on. There's so many rules coming out of those agencies and departments, and many of those rules are among the most significant and costly and intrusive of all, and yet they're not found anywhere in the cost stuff or even in the costs of 10,000. Well, I do have a placeholder for financial rules in 10,000 Commandments based on prior research, but those typically were left out. Now, independent agencies, of all of those executive orders I'd mentioned to you earlier from Trump, one I didn't mention was just that. He's got one bringing independent agencies under OMB review, which I think is really, really important. And another one, back in the Reagan administration, Don Devine headed the Office of Personnel Management, and he has a book of his own called Reagan's Terrible Swift Sword, in which at that time they'd eliminated over 100,000 civil service positions. And the same thing you just mentioned happened. There were challenges from all of these lawsuits, and they ended up prevailing. And I think there's sometimes I'll go and look at what the decisions are on these various lawsuits, and then during the week, like you say, there's several more lawsuits coming up. We need a grid, a scorecard keeping up with all these things. Actually, be a good project. But it is the case that some of those decisions regarding personnel are upheld. There can be delays, and then they get upheld. So there was that timidity, that timidness on the part of prior administrations to do these things, but some of them did lay good groundwork. I mean, what Susan did was great, and back in the Bush era at the OMB was where you saw some of the earliest work on bringing guidance documents under OMB review, which was important to do. So they made moves in this direction, but they were nowhere near as aggressive. And I feel like not Project 2025, but there are other outfits that had worked with Trump as well. In addition to that, I should say, not leaving it out, but they've been planning this for a long time. So Trump didn't come in like he did in the first term, not knowing what he wanted to do. He had these teams of folks working on it. So, and you can tell that in the orders and the way they're presented and the way they overlap. I wish there would be OMB guidance sort of tying all of these together, because the independent agencies, the good cause exemptions, the 1 in 10 out, the directive to say in the next unified agenda, put all of your priorities in place of what you're going to get rid of over the next year. It's just so much material, so much stuff that I think a lot of it is thought out, countered, of course, by the swamp things I mentioned to you earlier, like tariffs that could outweigh savings from regulatory reforms. But it's clearly more aggressive. I think he is. It is a second term. There was time to noodle it over, and it's like the things that were done before were taken up a notch. The reform officers becoming DOGE, the 1 in 2 out becoming 1 in 10 out, the cost benefit and efficiency stuff being changed to outright constitutionality and legality. It's a much more intense program. It's much more skeptical of the administrative state as such, except with things like concert tickets.
Trump will always have his hobby horses
Yeah,
that he's
always the
afraid of.
aberrations, right? The discordant stuff.
So again, taking sort of like a step back, big picture look at this, when you let in, I feel like you're always you're caught in the crossfire between people who want a quick, easy to digest number in terms of like
Yeah.
how much does this cost us, while also trying to say, well, really, when you think about it, it's difficult to measure, or even at certain level, it's almost impossible to get a real 100% perfect measure of, because when you zoom out enough, these costs are subjective, they change over time, but
Mhm.
also there's if you have a regulation that slows economic growth, uh, you have to account for all of the future missed economic growth that compounds over time. And how,
Yeah.
do you calculate that over the last 100 years or the last 150 years?
Right.
So just talk to us a little bit about how it's sort of the sort of frustrating part about trying to put a number on this when it's
Yeah.
something that ultimately there's maybe never one single number for it.
Right, right. I think it's really, really important. We have the figures that we have that I itemize in charts and things, and that we see each year are really just over the past, generation, the past, 20, 30 years. It was even up until the mid 1970s that the Federal Register didn't even tell you how many rules there were, let alone the cost. It's only since 76 that we could count the rules. And back then it was, over 7,000. Now it's generally around 3,000 every year. But rules can be different things. A big rule, can be minor effect. A thin document can be quite costly. But what I feel like is so much of the progressive. Well, Fred would say that the genius of Fred Smith, our founder, would say the genius of the progressives was they're recognizing that anything in government hands at the beginning of the progressive era, if they could keep it there, they could always maintain political control. So environmental amenities, airsheds, watersheds, spectrum, all of those never entered the wealth creating private property ambit of the free market and capitalism the way other resources did, or the way they might have. And so you've got this entire federal progressive state, the Federal Reserve, the antitrust laws, all of the New Deal programs, the social policies, the heavy regulation of transportation, the government involvement in these, government grants of rights of way and so forth. The spectrum, more recently drones, a 400-page rule to regulate drones, everything from pilot certifications to airworthiness to how high you got to be to drop your Amazon package and all that. Drones being put into 80-year-old federal airspace. Such things like that are extremely difficult to calculate. When you said compounding, that's the best word. I mean, just because you enact a regulation, you say, "Oh no, that's a sunk cost." No, I think the compounding effects do go on. I articulate that. In fact, I have a working paper called "Tip of the Cost Curve," and the subtitle is "On the Invalidity of All Regulatory Cost Estimates and the Need to Compile Them Anyway." And so
Mhm.
I'll put together, in economic and environmental and health and safety and labor and paperwork, all of these costs that the government has acknowledged, but then a little bit of discussion about, actually, you think about the compounding of this, or government regulations that are meant to enable the economy might end up hurting health and safety, like ethanol rules and things like that, where government programs backfire or do bad things, um, and try to point those things out. So what I do is, oh well, one way, if you were really really trying to force out what costs are, you could establish a regulatory cost budget, going forward, and say, well, you EPA can regulate up to this many billion, Department of Labor up to this many billion. If you really want to do more, you can trade credits,
Mhm.
regulatory credits with another agency. That kind of gets you to force out cost estimates. But none of that is really the answer, because the answer is Congress, we always say, and it's true, has delegated too much power to agencies that they ought not have in the first place. And the only way to internalize regulatory costs is to make Congress approve those costs, like it would do under the RAINS Act.
Mhm.
The second or third or maybe fourth best way is what I just mentioned about a cost cap that we've talked about and even testified about. But it was really COVID that was kind of the shaker for me, because I was seeing, I just did a post today, as a matter of fact, and I used that image of Donald Trump turning to Mitch McConnell, signing the CARES Act,
Mhm.
saying, "I've never signed anything with a T on it. This is trillions of dollars. Are you sure we can do this? I guess we can't stop now, right, Mitch?" And so away we go with these huge expenditures, and you only had one guy in Congress opposing it. And then my fears about the next crisis doing the same thing, because coronavirus wasn't our first crisis of this century. Keeps happening. government ratchets up and it doesn't deflate. I mean, that we just mentioned we're 7 trillion this year. We've got a deficit of 2 trillion, just like we had back in 2020. So the problem the problem is overdelegation. I've spent my career saying that. However, COVID and the aftermath, the inflation law, the infrastructure law, all this has made me realize we really, really have an enumerated powers problem more so than the and it's always been the case. I mean, that's how we got the administrative state.
Mhm.
But it's really in much sharper relief now when we see the programs that Congress has done just in the spending alone, which are already regulatory. So it wouldn't even really matter in a sense what I say the cost of regulation is if I'm not getting Congress to affirm those costs and we're not saying going forward that Congress is doing too much in the first place and it ought not be allowed to do X, Y, and Z, that it ought to adhere to administrative powers. So that's really the pursuit. It's driven by what I see now as this fusion of spending and regulation that are escalating federal enterprise in harmony in a bad way. And that's what I'm trying to push back on. So we point out the deficit, we point out the debt, we point out regulatory costs to the extent we can, and say, oh, and by the way, they're a lot higher than this. But here's what we're working with, and Congress needs to take back its authority, but also stop using that authority on things they ought not be doing.
All right. So yeah, when we look at that number every year, that the cost of federal regulation, that's a minimum. We'll say it's a dynamic
Yeah,
minimum. All right, Wayne, this has been an excellent conversation, and I know our listeners are happy to have you back
thank you.
from episode 3 to episode 120. And before we go, where should people find all your work online?
Yeah, just go to our website, cei.org. You can find it. You can find, CEI. When I talk to other folks in radio shows and all about this, that's the unique thing about CEI. You got a lot of groups in town working on tax and budget, social issues, and things like that. CEI from the beginning has always been regulatory policy. And we've got folks doing, your financial issues, labor issues, and so forth, just across the board. We've got a team doing environmental policy. The regulatory state, if you're missing that, you're missing the biggest part of government's influence in the economy. And I think CEI carved out an important niche on that from the very beginning.
All right, agreed. Thanks again for being with us, Wayne.
You bet. Thank you. Thank you for having me.